The job posting seemed too good to be true, a paid internship at Elias, a legacy data archival firm, offering $20 an hour to digitize old paper records. I needed the money desperately after dropping out of college, so I didn't ask too many questions when they hired me on the spot. The building itself should have been my first warning. It was a brutalist concrete block tucked behind a dying strip mall, with narrow windows that barely let in any natural light. Inside, the temperature was kept unnaturally cold, and the fluorescent lights hummed with a persistent, headache-inducing drone. The office layout was supposedly open concept, but the cubicle walls were tall enough to create isolated little cells. On my first day, I met the only other intern working there, a guy named Elias. He was impossibly tall, maybe 6'5", with a skeletal frame that seemed to fold in on itself when he sat down. His skin was the color of skim milk, stretched tight over prominent bones, and his greasy black hair hung in curtains over his gaunt face. When the supervisor introduced us, Elias didn't shake my hand or even look at me directly. He just gave a small nod and returned to his computer, where he immediately began hammering at the keyboard with an intensity that seemed almost violent. The sound echoed through the silent office like gunshots. For the first week, I convinced myself that Elias was just intensely focused on his work. We were stationed in adjacent cubicles, separated by a fabric divider that reached about 5 feet high. I'm 5'8", so when I sat down, the wall provided complete privacy. But Elias was different. I started noticing things on the third day. I'd be working on a spreadsheet, completely absorbed in my task, when I'd suddenly feel the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck would stand up, and a cold prickle would run down my spine. The first time it happened, I turned around quickly, expecting to find my supervisor checking on my progress. Instead, I saw Elias. He had stood up slowly, unfurling that unnaturally long spine until his head cleared the top of my cubicle wall by at least 6 inches. He wasn't just glancing over, he was leaning his chin on the fabric divider, staring at me with this stretched, frozen grin that didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were dead, like a doll's eyes. "Working hard, Ronnie," he said, though I'd never told him my name. His voice was strange, a soft, high-pitched, performative lilt, like a 1950s radio host trying to sound playful. But there was something artificial about it, like he was doing a bad impression of how humans were supposed to sound. The encounters became more frequent. Every day, multiple times a day, I'd feel that crawling sensation and turn to find Elias's head hovering above my cubicle wall like a pale moon. He'd always have that same plastic smile, and he'd always speak in that unsettling, theatrical voice. "Hardly working, Ronnie," he'd drawl, dragging out the syllables. Or, "Taking a break, are we?" The worst part wasn't what he said, it was how long he'd hold the position. After speaking, he wouldn't immediately sink back down. He'd just stand there, chin resting on the divider, smiling at me for 10, sometimes 15 seconds of excruciating silence. I'd laugh awkwardly, trying to signal that the interaction was over, but he seemed immune to social cues. Finally, he'd slowly descend behind the wall with this deliberate, mechanical movement, like a periscope retracting. I started wearing headphones to avoid conversation, but it didn't help. I could still feel when he was watching. I tried to focus on my work, treating him like office furniture, something to ignore and work around. But Elias had other plans. He began studying me. I noticed him tilting his head at odd angles when he thought I wasn't looking, as if he were analyzing my movements. Cataloging my habits. The way I organized my desk. The way I typed. The way I stretched my neck when I was tired. The real violation came during my second week. I had never spoken to Elias about my personal life. I kept my interactions purely professional, brief hellos in the morning, nothing more. During lunch breaks, I'd sit in my car and scroll through my phone while eating a sandwich. One particular Tuesday, I was reading an article about a very specific, obscure true crime podcast I was obsessed with called Tides and Tragedies. It covered cold cases involving bodies found near waterways. The episode 1 was reading about involved a missing woman whose remains were allegedly hidden in a marsh in Oregon. I had never mentioned this podcast to anyone at work. I hadn't even mentioned that I liked true crime. Suddenly, I felt that familiar cold presence behind me. I hadn't heard him approach. Elias moved silently despite his size, like a cat or a ghost. I was sitting in my cubicle, and he had somehow crossed the distance from his desk to mine without making a sound. He leaned down, his mouth inches from my ear, and whispered in a voice completely different from his usual theatrical tone. This voice was flat, emotionless, and somehow worse. "Do you think they'll ever find the body in the marsh?" My blood turned to ice. I spun around in my chair, nearly knocking over my coffee. "What did you just say?" He giggled, not a normal laugh, but this high-pitched, stuttering sound, like a broken music box. Then he tilted his head back at an unnatural angle and walked away. I couldn't focus for the rest of the day. How had he known? I'd been reading the article on my phone, holding it close to my chest. Even if he'd been watching from his cubicle, he couldn't have seen the screen from that angle. Unless he'd been standing directly behind me, reading over my shoulder. The thought made me nauseous. That night, I went home and triple-checked that all my social media accounts were set to private. I searched for Elias online but found nothing, no Facebook, no Instagram, no LinkedIn. It was like he didn't exist outside of that office. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. Maybe he listened to the same podcast. Maybe he'd just made a lucky guess. But deep down, I knew better. He had been watching my screen. He had been studying me that closely. Over the next few days, I became hypervigilant. I started turning off my phone during work hours, keeping my computer screen angled away from the aisle. I stopped taking lunch breaks in my car and instead ate quickly in the break room. But the feeling of being watched never went away. If anything, it intensified. I'd catch glimpses of Elias in my peripheral vision, always standing just a little too close, always staring just a little too long. The supervisor, Martin, seemed oblivious to the whole thing. The few times I saw him, he was rushing between meetings, barely acknowledging us in turns. 2 weeks after the podcast incident, something happened that shattered any remaining sense of security I had. It was a Tuesday evening, around 8 o'clock. I was at home, sitting on my couch and watching TV, trying to decompress from another tense day at the office. My phone rang, an unknown number. I normally don't answer unknown calls, but I'd been waiting to hear back about an apartment application, so I picked up. "Hello?" For 10 seconds, there was nothing but silence. Not dead air, I could hear breathing. Heavy, wet breathing, like someone had just finished running. Then, cutting through the static, came a voice I recognized immediately. It was Elias, but he wasn't using that fake, theatrical tone. He was screaming, his voice distorting into a hysterical, high-pitched shriek that barely sounded human. "The tide is coming in, Ronnie. Pull your boat out of the water. Pull it out. Pull it out." Then came the laughter, loud, unhinged, echoing like he was in a small, empty room. I hung up immediately, my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. My heart was pounding in my ears. How did he get my number? I'd never given it to him. It wasn't listed in any company directory. I checked the caller ID, my stomach churning. The number displayed made me feel like I was losing my mind. It was my home landline. My own house phone had called my cell phone. He had spoofed my number. The next morning, I went straight to Martin's office before even sitting down at my desk. I told him everything, the stalking, the invasion of privacy, the phone call. Martin listened with a furrowed brow, his fingers steepled under his chin. When I finished, he looked genuinely confused. "Elias," he said slowly. "Ronnie, we let Elias go last Friday. He stopped showing up for work 3 days in a row, so we terminated him." The floor seemed to drop out from under me. "What? No. That's not possible. He was here yesterday. I saw him." Martin shook his head. "You must be mistaken. Elias hasn't been in the building since last Thursday. Are you feeling okay? Maybe you should take the rest of the day off." I stumbled out of his office in a daze. If Elias had been fired, who had been sitting in the cubicle behind me yesterday? Who had I heard typing? I walked over to Elias's desk. It was completely bare, no computer, no personal items, no evidence that anyone had been there recently. A thin layer of dust covered the surface. My mind reeled. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my grip on reality? No. I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd heard. That afternoon, around 2 o'clock, the sky outside turned an ominous bruised purple. A summer storm was rolling in fast. By 3 o'clock, the rain was coming down in sheets, hammering against the building's metal roof with a deafening roar. The office manager sent out an email telling everyone to leave early and beat the flooding. Within minutes, the office emptied out, people grabbing their bags and rushing to the parking lot. I was about to leave too when Martin stopped me. "Ronnie, I hate to ask, but we're in the middle of a crucial server migration. If we don't finish it by end of business today, we'll lose the window for the whole month. Would you be willing to stay until 5 to monitor it? I'll pay you overtime." I hesitated, glancing out at the storm. But I needed the money, and it was only 2 more hours. "Sure," I said. "No problem." By 4 o'clock, I was alone in the building. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic hammering of rain and the low hum of the servers. I sat at my desk, watching progress bars crawl across the screen, counting down the minutes until I could leave. At 5:15, the power died. It wasn't a flicker or a brownout, it was a hard, immediate cut. The hum of the servers vanished, plunging the office into complete silence except for the roar of rain. A second later, the emergency lights kicked in, bathing everything in a sickly orange glow that cast long, distorted shadows across the cubicle maze. I decided to leave immediately. I packed my bag and used my phone's flashlight to navigate toward the front exit. The emergency lights created pockets of deep shadow between the cubicles, and I found myself walking faster, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I reached the main glass doors, I pushed against them. They didn't budge. I pushed harder, throwing my shoulder into it. Nothing. I pointed my flashlight at the handles and felt my stomach drop. There, looped through both handles, was a thick industrial chain secured with a shiny new padlock. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The chain was on the inside. Someone had locked me in from the inside. "No, no, no," I whispered, pulling frantically at the chain. It held firm. I ran to the back exit, the one leading to the loading dock. Locked. The side fire exit had a metal chair wedged under the handle. I pulled out my phone to call 911. No service. 0 bars. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers, and we were already in a spotty coverage area. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the phone. Then, from somewhere deep in the office near the break room, I heard a sound. Click! A beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping slowly across the far wall. Footsteps echoed on the linoleum, slow, deliberate, wet footsteps, like someone who'd been standing outside in the rain. My body moved on pure instinct. I dropped behind the reception desk, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. I pressed my back against the desk, trying to control my breathing, trying to stay silent. "Ronnie!" The voice drifted through the darkness like smoke. That same sing-song, taunting tone I'd come to dread. But now, in the empty building, it sounded even more inhuman. Come out, wherever you are." I risked a glance over the edge of the desk. 50 feet away, barely visible in the orange emergency lighting, stood Elias. He was holding a flashlight under his chin, illuminating his face from below in a grotesque mask of shadows. He was soaking wet, water dripping from his hair and clothes, forming a puddle around his feet. He must have been outside during the storm. He must have broken back in somehow. But he wasn't frantically searching for me. He was moving casually, almost leisurely, tilting his head as he scanned the room. He knew I had nowhere to go. I crawled on my hands and knees, staying low, moving toward Martin's office where I remembered seeing a landline phone. Maybe, somehow, it would still work. Thunder cracked overhead, and lightning flashed through the windows, giving me strobe-like glimpses of my surroundings. Each flash revealed Elias getting closer, methodically knocking over stacks of paper, flipping chairs, making a game of it. "I know you're here, Ronnie," he called out in that horrible voice. "We're friends, aren't we?" Friends don't hide from each other. I reached Martin's office and crawled inside, shutting the door as quietly as I could. My hands found the phone on the desk. I lifted the receiver to my ear. Dead air. The line had been cut. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't random. This was planned. He'd been preparing for this. Suddenly, the beam of his flashlight hit the glass wall of the office. I froze. Through the glass, I could see his silhouette, his head tilted at that unnatural angle. "I see you," he whispered, his face pressed against the glass, his breath fogging it up. He didn't try to open the door. Instead, he stepped back and raised a fire extinguisher he'd grabbed from the wall. Time seemed to slow as he swung it forward. The impact was explosive. Glass shattered everywhere, spraying across the floor in a glittering cascade. I scrambled backward as he began stepping through the broken frame, his movements careful and deliberate. I grabbed the only weapon I could find, the heavy stapler from Martin's desk. It felt pathetically inadequate in my hand, but it was all I had. As Elias ducked a step through the frame, I bolted past him, running as fast as I could toward the break room. Behind me, I heard his laughter, that same guttural, wet sound from the phone call. His heavy boots thudded against the floor, matching my pace. I burst into the break room, my eyes immediately going to the small window high on the wall. It was narrow and unbarred, my only chance. I jumped onto the counter, my shoes slipping on the laminate surface. I could hear him right behind me now, so close I could smell him, a mixture of rain, sweat, and something else, something rotten. I kicked at the window with everything I had. Once. Twice. On the third kick, the latch broke. I grabbed the frame and pulled myself up, my shoulders barely fitting through the opening. Just as I started to squeeze through, I felt a cold hand wrap around my ankle. His grip was strong, pulling me back. I kicked blindly, connecting with something, his face, maybe, and heard him grunt. His grip loosened for just a second. That was enough. I pulled myself through and fell onto the wet grass outside, landing hard on my shoulder. Pain shot through my arm, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I didn't look back. I ran through the torrential rain, my feet sliding in the mud, screaming for help even though I knew no one was around. I ran until I reached the main road, waving my arms frantically at an approaching truck. The driver stopped, and I collapsed against his door, gasping, crying, trying to explain. The police arrived 20 minutes later with 3 squad cars. By the time they entered the building, the chains were gone. The back door was standing wide open, rain blowing in. Elias had vanished. But they found something else. In the crawl space above the ceiling tiles, directly over my desk, they discovered a sleeping bag, empty food wrappers, a notebook filled with detailed observations about my daily routine, and dozens of photos of me taken from above. He'd been living in the walls. For weeks, maybe longer, he'd been up there, listening to me, watching me, learning everything about me. The notebook contained entries written in crumbling handwriting, my arrival times, my lunch habits, what I wore, even fragments of phone conversations I'd had. The last entry, dated that morning, simply read, "Tonight. The storm. Perfect." I never returned to Elias. I quit over the phone the next day and moved back in with my parents 3 states away. The police never found Elias. They couldn't even confirm his real identity, the name on his employment paperwork was fake, and the address didn't exist. It's been 8 months now. I've started therapy, started rebuilding my life. But sometimes, especially when it rains, I find myself staring out windows, scanning tree lines and dark corners. Last week, during a thunderstorm, I was looking out my bedroom window when lightning flashed. For just a split second, I could swear I saw a tall, pale figure standing at the edge of the woods behind my parents' house, a flashlight held under its chin, illuminating that frozen, plastic smile. I blinked, and it was gone. I tell myself it was my imagination, a trick of the light and shadow. But I've started sleeping with my door locked and a chair wedged under the handle. Just in case. Because deep down, I know the truth. Elias wasn't just a disturbed coworker. He was something else, something that had learned to mimic human behavior but had never quite gotten it right. Something that had chosen me for reasons I'll never understand. And I know, with a certainty that keeps me awake at night, that he's still out there somewhere. Still watching. Still waiting. Still learning how to be me.